And we're off. Now, I'll say good morning, and you can say good afternoon. Mr. Jonathan Wright.
Okay.
How are you?
I'm very well. I'm very well. You've definitely gone down in the world. You were interviewing Vince Vaughn last time I saw you on social media.
Yeah, that was
now you're interviewing me in my front room. So
listen, don't put yourself down. You know what I mean? You should be honored that I've got you on the show. Vince wasn't available.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
Vince wasn't available, unfortunately. I think he's a bit busy making his millions. So I've got
Owen Wilson not available either.
Yeah. Well, Gabriel Macht, who played Harvey Specter, he's a little bit busy as well. So never mind. I've gone for the next best. I've gone for the next best thing. A very good afternoon to you in Hong Kong, Mr. Wright. Really good to see you. I haven't spoken in a long, long time since you left Qatar. How is the wonders of the Far East?
Very good, mate. Very good. No, seriously, thanks for having me. It's great to see you. It's it feels like a lifetime ago that I left Doha. So
I'll bet. Yeah, how long ago was it?
I left in about March, April time 2015 and moved to Hong Kong in June 2015.
Awesome.
I was in Qatar from late 2008 until then. So we were almost 6 years here and almost 7 years when I was.
We were around about the same time, weren't we? I was 2008 and so were you. In that big sort of 2-year bubble before it kind of burst with the recession, and it was a busy couple of years for all of us. Just by way of introduction to our viewers, welcome along to Space Design and Build podcast with me, your host Simon Joss, and my guest, Mr. Jonathan Wright, who has a wealth of experience which we're going to touch on. But for those that don't know you, tell us a bit about yourself, Jonathan, and where you've been and where you are now.
Yeah, so I was in. I'll start with I guess my time in Doha, if you like. I moved there from the UK. I've always been in real estate, most of the time on the transaction side of the business, and still am. So I did almost 7 years in Doha working for DTZ, who are now Cushman, and then moved to Hong Kong with Colliers, and been here almost 6 years, and I founded and lead our flexible workspace consulting business for Asia Pac, and we've since added people in covering Europe and the Americas. Since I kicked this off, it's had various iterations, but kicked this off way back in sort of late 2015.
Fantastic. But you weren't doing that when you were in Qatar. It was primarily real estate and sort of contract leasing. So it's a big difference between what you were doing here and what you were doing in Hong Kong. Dare I ask, what do you prefer?
No, I mean, it's still fairly similar. I think when I was in Doha, essentially leasing office space. I'm still leasing office space. I guess it's just the approach to it is slightly different. So when I was in Doha, it was, I was still working with landlords and still working with occupiers, and working with some flexible workspace operators. And I guess I'm doing the same here. It's just, I guess, a little bit of a slightly different approach. When I moved to Hong Kong in 2015, I realized the market was pretty competitive here. And someone at Colliers said at the time that you probably need to specialize. And I kind of looked back at my time in the Middle East and what I knew kind of more about. And I guess when I was in the Middle East, way back when to 2008, I worked on a deal when I was at DTZ with a colleague who's still in Doha now, Mark Proudly. I helped him out on a deal with Servcorp, who took a couple of floors in Commercial Bank Plaza, and worked with a guy called Lockie Buchanan, who I'm still good mates with to this day. He's based in Australia now. And he was at Servcorp at the time, and I worked with him on a couple of others when they took Tornado Tower and the building that is in your background right now.
Your favorite building, isn't it? You miss it, don't you?
Amazing, beautiful. Yes, I worked with those guys on that and worked with Lucky quite closely, understanding their business from a serviced office, flexible workspace perspective. Also, I had another friend who's still in the Middle East, who's in Dubai, called Matt Hammond, who was at Regis for a while, now IWG. And so when I kind of moved to Asia, I guess I realized that I knew more about that specific sector than the average broker or average leasing guy. And kind of took that with everything else that I'd learned throughout my time in the UK and also in Doha, in terms of working with landlords, working with occupiers, and then sort of really just applying that in a slightly different way to really look at what I do now, which is the flexible workspace consulting business, which breaks into three parts. As I said, of various iterations, is looking at working with our occupier clients, primarily large corporates, looking at how they can leverage the flexible workspace sector as part of their real estate strategy, and working with operators, so the likes of Still Surf Corp, but many others, and then hospitality operators, looking at strategically how they can grow their businesses and how they can work with corporates and how they can work with landlords. And then finally, advising some of Asia's largest landlords, and also working with my colleague Tom Slee in the UK on some projects there in Europe, back in Europe, where we're working on some really interesting projects there and some super interesting projects in Asia, where we're advising landlords and just how they ultimately can make their buildings more attractive. And I think what underlines all of that, and this is something I've said for years, is that, look, as a real estate professional, I don't make the market. As somebody who works in fit out, you don't make the market. As a landlord doesn't make the market. An operator doesn't make the market. Ultimately, what makes the market is the occupier.
Yeah.
And ultimately what drives them is their employees, and making sure that they are productive, they have a good day at work, they're healthy. And all of these things are, I guess, are coming to the fore, particularly in the last 12 months, but will come into the fore anyway. And I think that really drives the market. And I think it's up to me, it's up to you, it's up to landlords, it's up to operators to react to that and basically provide the occupiers with what they need, or essentially what their employees need, so that they can be productive and they could have a successful business. And I guess it's up to all of us to take what the occupiers need and help and support that.
I would wholeheartedly agree with you. You've got to listen to what the end user is looking for, and it will always vary. It will always vary from region to region, country to country. You've got enough experience of the Middle East and Qatar in particular, where how many times did you deal with a corporate office? How many times have I dealt with a corporate office that have bench desking in an open plan area? The managers or assistant managers, supervisors have a small office, then the directors have a bigger office, and then the CEO has the even bigger office. And then because it's the Middle East, usually the chairman, who has several companies, has the biggest office in the corner that they tend to use maybe once a quarter. So you've got that particular, and you're not going to be able to change that philosophy, maybe ever, but certainly not quickly. You then turn that on its head, and we'll go to, let's say, Silicon Valley. Let's say we'll go to the States, and we'll look at the Googles of the world and the Facebooks and the Spotifys and companies like this that are completely fluid, that are minimal desking. Everything is hot desking, third spaces, bean bags, and that usual typical Google office that people want to try and generate. And then you've got everything else in the middle, because it changes, as we said, from region to region and company to company. You're never going to get it one way. Companies are always going to operate in different ways because of different sectors and because of different beliefs. And it's driven, I think, 100% by the employees in that region. If you look at the modern day employee, they're not necessarily loyal. They're constantly moving around. They're constantly moving from company to company, and companies are having to react to them to excite them to stay, as well as to excite them to work within their organization. And that's the environment. That wholeheartedly starts with the environment. How do you think that the multinationals of, let's say, the Far East at the moment, how are they coping with the new generation, and what has COVID done to their thought process when it comes to space and workplace efficiency?
Yeah, I think we're in a really interesting time for real estate generally, right? I think everyone is in a state of flux. But I think ultimately I guess I'm using a cliche here of the last 12 months, that COVID has, I don't think necessarily changed anything or changed the course of anything. I think it's accelerated the course that we were already on. Yeah. I'm fortunate enough to be in Asia, where I think it's one of the most progressive places in the world. I think there's some really great examples in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in Sydney, in Melbourne, and other places in Australia, but particularly those markets where, you know, the employee's kind of well-being and how an employee interacts with space is getting taken super seriously. I'm sure it's going to be taken super seriously in the Middle East and in Asia and in the UK and Europe as well. But from what I'm seeing, is occupiers take this super seriously. And I think it'll come down to giving employees choice. And I don't think we're no longer going to see just I trying to get away from cliches and stuff that hasn't been said before. But, you know, I think we're going to go away from, you know, the big shiny HQ building in the middle of town. I think we're not going to go away from that altogether, but I think we're going to have more choice, and we're going to have certain times of the week people are going to be working from home, certain times of the week people are going to be working from maybe a nearby coffee shop or co-working space, and certain times of the week they're going to be in the office. And certain times of the week, they might be in the office building, but not necessarily in their office space. So we've kind of going from a situation where 100% of the time, 100% of the people are sat at a desk in the office, to a much, much more fluid situation. And that might be, I think activity-based working has been around a very, very long time. But the flexible workspace sector as a whole can play a part in supporting an occupier's real estate strategy. And the way that we look at it with Colliers is that breaks down into certain aspects. You know, in a building or in any given building, there might be a lounge and meeting spaces that are either provided by the landlord or a hospitality or a co-working operator. There might be some smaller private offices that people can take on demand to allow occupiers to sort of flex up and down in their building. And there might be, you know, their traditional space that they have on a slightly longer term. And I think what we might see, and I think we're at the very early stages of it, is technology playing a really big part to kind of supplement that and try and remove, because when you start to move away from this big office, you break these things down into these different pieces, you create a lot of friction for the user. Mm-hmm. And I think we might see a lot of technology solutions come in the next few years, and we're already seeing some of those, but we might see some technology solutions to start to remove that friction. Whereas a corporate occupier, I think you've really got to start with, you know, what do my employees need, and then sort of build up from that in terms of what your actual solution is. And I think, it's going to look very different to where it looks today, or definitely 12 months ago. But fundamentally, it'll come down to giving employees choice. But part of that choice is definitely going to be in the HQ building. And part of that choice will be outsourced. Part of that choice will be working from home.
Yeah. And you've also got to consider the customer-facing employees, customer-facing businesses. You touched on it, where the big shiny office in, let's say, the center of London, where you're now limiting the amount of clients that are visiting that particular office. You have less employees coming into the office. The time in a place like London, I'm sure Hong Kong is, and the Far East is fairly similar, where it's potentially taken an hour and a half to get into the office and an hour and a half home. An employee is going to not make that choice. An employee is not going to spend 3 hours logistically traveling into an office if they don't actually have to. And then you touched on technology. If the client facing can happen in the way that we're doing this, you'll then find that you'll have much more media rooms, you'll have much more focus rooms, you'll have phone booths that are technology based and communication based that makes the company more efficient. Do you think that is then going to ultimately result in the city center offices being less, and therefore the location will change to reduce OPEX? And do you think that the size of the offices will reduce as well, because fundamentally they're going into a multiple choice arena of flexible workspaces and working from home as well as the full-time office?
Yeah, maybe it's an age thing, Joffrey. I think me and you are at a certain vintage where we probably still appreciate a face-to-face meeting and a handshake. So probably showing our age maybe there, but I think there's an angle there where face-to-face is important. It's important for companies building culture. It's important for staff learning and experience. I think there's a lot of stuff to be learned by a junior member of staff working with a more senior member of staff. So from that perspective, I think you're still going to need to bring people to the office, and I think you will have choice, and I think it's going to be a very challenging balancing act going forward, and hopefully we can support our clients with that balancing act to figure out exactly what that strategy is, and then not just figuring out what that strategy is. The difficult part of real estate is actually executing on that strategy, because real estate inherently is not that fluid. So you've got to be able to execute on that strategy. It's not always easy. So I think working through that, you've got to look at different solutions. And again, I go back to technology, and technology could be a Zoom call like we're having today, but technology could also be an app on your phone. Like Colliers have partnered with a technology provider to create the Colliers Mobility Pass, and what we've done there is we've brought online thousands of flexible workspace operators from around the world, and allowed occupiers to basically give their employees access to that platform to use a range of spaces that might be in a more convenient place closer to home. And that will definitely be part of a strategy. There will be potentially people taking less space and relying on shared meeting rooms that a landlord might provide within the same building. But I still think people will, by and large, still have a headquarters. And I guess it's figuring out when and where people need to be going at what times, and making sure that you're managing that effectively while still giving your employees choice. It's not an easy thing to pull off, but I think that will happen. And then you will then see pressure on landlords to adapt their buildings. I think we've had in most markets around the world, we've had a period of probably 5 to 10 years where rents have just been going up, and landlords haven't really needed to do a lot with their buildings other than, ask for rent every month and sign a lease, which is, it's not landlord's fault that the market has created that situation. So landlords have been able to do it. I think now landlords and most big landlords recognize this, is that they'll may have to make their buildings sweat a little bit more for their money, which is not necessarily a bad thing. And there are ways to do that, to potentially even create more value in your building. And that there's tons of ways to look at that.
do you think that landlords are going to face much more release clause conversations because tenants are unsure of continuing in the space that they have, or they want to optimize, not necessarily leave, but I think landlords will be under pressure to be more flexible if there is something in the contract that people can exploit or instigate? Are you hearing much of that in the Far East?
Yeah, I think the flexibility genie is out of the bottle and it's not going back in. I think a big challenge for landlords has not been that they haven't wanted to provide it. Of course, ultimately, as we said earlier, the occupier is at the center of this universe, and they're the customer essentially. So landlords do want to provide what that customer wants. It's not that they don't want to provide it. It's that a lot of these buildings are financed in some way, and the capital markets haven't really adapted to how to value assets that have a large degree of flexibility attached to them. It's very easy to value a building that has a blue chip corporate on a 10-year lease paying the same amount of rent every month that goes up by a couple of percent every year. It's really easy to value that. It's a lot harder to value something that's much more variable in nature. So you've got to kind of look at that, and there's yet to be some precedent, and some of the things that have happened so far is the perceived wisdom is that if it's got more flexibility, it's therefore higher risk and it's therefore lower value. We at Colliers don't necessarily subscribe to that. I think we think that, with that flexibility compared to market becomes some potentially higher returns. And if there's still a track record and evidence that space is mature and it's still being used, and you've got good occupancy using that space, there's no reason to apply discount cap rates to it. So we think that shouldn't impact value too much. Now that's yet to be adopted by the RICS. So, but if it does, I think that will enable landlords to actually finance buildings that have a greater degree of flexibility and therefore offer that flexibility to the occupier, the end user, the customer. So, but what we think and know, because there's some big case studies that we're working on in Asia and have worked on in Asia and have worked on in Europe, is landlords bringing in far more amenitized, what we call amenitization of office buildings. Some people call hotelization of office buildings, where, if you take a building stack, historically, you might have a coffee shop on the ground floor, you have a reception, if you're lucky, you might have a restaurant, and if you're lucky, you might have a restaurant and a gym, into a far more integrated offering, particularly at the top end of the market, the more sophisticated landlords bringing in essentially hospitality services. And if you imagine an office building to be a hotel, in a hotel, you've got a great concierge, you've got a great restaurant, you've probably got some wellness facilities, you've got a gym, you've got that sort of softer touch. And instead of being hotel rooms, you've got office floors, basically. So that just creates, I think, a bigger relationship between the landlord and the actual end user, people like me and you turn up to work every day, and gives you a kind of essentially a B2C relationship rather than a B2B. So you can potentially then you can start to monetize that in other ways that you might not have been monetizing. Previously, landlords, would sign a lease and in 5 years' time would take the CFO or the head of real estate or the CEO out for a boozy lunch and sign for another 5 years and increase the rent by 20%, and everyone gets on with their life. I think now, essentially, the employees have got far more power in their organizations, and they're telling people what they want. And I think part of that will be monetizing that individual of the space rather than monetizing the CEO, the CFO, or the head of real estate once every 5 years. If you walking into, you were drinking your cup of tea earlier, you're walking into a building, you might buy a cup of tea, you might buy a coffee, you might use the gym for half an hour a day, you might do something else in the building, you might have services that landlord can deliver to you, it might be dry cleaning, it might be getting your hair cut. You've not got much left, Joffy, but it might be getting your hair cut. So
you said earlier,
you look at all these things. So you look at all these things as ways to monetize that, right? So I think landlords are doing it. I think there's a lot of people out there who give landlords a hard time. I understand their challenges, and I think it's guiding those landlords to a solution that still makes sense within the constraints in which they work, because ultimately a landlord still has to finance that building. A landlord probably still has to pay a mortgage on that building every month. He still needs to raise money against it or debt against it. So there's, the landlords don't just have a bottomless pit of cash to give the tenants everything they want. They have restraints in which they can work in. In a similar way to occupiers, they have restrictions in terms of what they can do. Might be, take Qatar, for example. If you're a QFC tenant, you're member of the QFC, you've got to be in certain buildings, you've got to do certain things, you've got compliance issues. If you're an insurance company, you've got to comply by certain things. If you're a bank, you've got to go and comply by certain things. If you're a bank or a trader, you can't just go and let your staff go and work out the coffee shop and sit on their phone doing confidential work. You just can't do it. So part of our job, mine and yours, is to look at what the ideal solution is, but look at the realities around that. And quite often there are things you can tweak and get around, and quite often there are things you can't. So one of the things for us, and I think this is where I've had some success in Asia doing, is working with a landlord, working with the occupier, and working with the operator, all three sides, to find solutions to what ultimately the occupier is trying to get to, that the operator can deliver, or the landlord can deliver via the operator, to ultimately get to solutions that give them a better outcome. Might not be the perfect outcome, but it's a better outcome.
Yeah.
And I think these things are incremental, and you can't just shift from here to here overnight. There are things in the way, so it's a balancing act.
Yeah, it's a transition over not even months. It's over years. You used a word earlier called accelerate or expedite what was already happening, whether that be technology or whether that be landlords having to pivot into hotelization and creating further amenities, which they have, as you well know. Some of the buildings and landlords in Qatar have started to do probably maybe only a couple of years ago. Maybe Alasmak is a good example. Tornado, as you well know, a lot of it is about hospitality and food and beverage and that sort of health and wellness within that kind of West Bay area. Again, flexibility in parking is important to ensure that people can get in and get out as pain-free as possible. And I think the key word is that they've had to pivot. Companies have had to pivot with regards to their employees. I think we can both agree, and no one can disagree, that the standard office of 100% of employees and 100% utilization, 8 till 5, 9 till 5, it no longer exists. The flexibility genie, again, as you pointed out, is out of the lamp, and it's who wants to pivot the most. I think it's a really exciting time because it's making everyone, me, you, landlords, consultants, property managers, facilities managers, and of course, the end users, it's making them think, right, what does our business need for the next, fundamentally, 5 years? But it must be really difficult to be able to still plan that when we're in this kind of still a hybrid situation, an unprecedented situation where no one really knows. Do you think that it now is the time, having gone through this pandemic for well over a year now, and with different strains that are coming? Yes, vaccinations are rolling out fairly swiftly in across the globe. But do you think that we just bite the bullet and we say, right, this is now the norm? There isn't a reverse of this. We have to go flexible. We have to pivot, and then it allows that movement if things improve and we want more people in the office. But if they don't improve, or we have to go lockdown or semi-lockdown, at least the business can have that flexibility to move left and move right. Is now the time that multinationals are or should make those decisions, bite the bullet, and move into that flexible era?
I'm going to answer this in a slightly different way. I think we should always be evolving. And I think that evolution, as I said, I think we were already on that track anyway. And I think we probably skipped 5, maybe even 10 years in the last 12, 18 months. But we should never stop, because, as I have mentioned before, there's been certain things that have happened in the real estate market in the last 5 to 10 years, and particularly in the last 5, and particularly in the flexible workspace sector, where things have come along and disrupted the market, but then they've disrupted the market because the market hasn't evolved. But then they themselves haven't evolved and they've been disrupted. So what I've called it is, the disruptor's been disrupted because the disruptor didn't evolve. So I think it's hard to say for a landlord, for an operator, or for an occupier that this is it, we're going in this direction and we're all going to run 100 miles an hour in that direction. Because that direction, or where we want to go, will maybe move over time.
Yep.
And there's no maybe about it. It will move over time. And what's right today might not necessarily be right tomorrow. So I think it's always incremental. But we're seeing so much interest from our corporate occupier clients in the flexible workspace sector and leveraging that sector as part of their corporate real estate strategy. And it's everything from an occupier that might lease an entire building for their own operations, that maybe want to downsize that or give their staff some flexibility to access other spaces in other parts of town or other parts of the world, in fact. We're seeing a lot of occupiers look to even close entire offices down and move entirely to a digital platform. We've seen some examples of that in the press recently, with not necessarily closing down their offices, but we've seen, Standard Chartered Bank give their staff, their entire global staff, access to IWG, which is the largest flexible workspace operator in the world, 3,500 locations around the world, and Standard Chartered Bank staff now have access to all 3,500 of those spaces. And IWG are doing that because they've got a big platform. Colliers have developed this platform, as I mentioned earlier, that doesn't actually have IWG on it, but has a lot of other operators on it, that has great coverage. And we're speaking to at least 10 to 20 occupiers that are looking to do something similar. Doesn't mean they're looking to close their offices, but it means they're looking to supplement their offices with that technology solution. And we've seen it for a long time. There's an operator in the US called Convene, and there's an operator there's various operators in Asia, the Executive Center and Work Project being 2 of them, that do a really great job at partnering with landlords, but then working with the occupiers in that building to give those occupiers in that building access to meeting and conferencing space. So if you're a law firm and you have a town hall meeting once a month and you build the space for that and it stands empty for the other 29 days of the month, why would you hold that on your books? You would much rather outsource that to either an operator or a landlord via an operator or a landlord themselves, that can offer you that space. And there's some landlords that have delivered their own product in that fashion. Hong Kong Land, Swire Properties have got something similar in both in Hong Kong, Capital Land in Singapore, and lots of examples in Australia, where people are using that and they're using that space, and it means they can take less square footage themselves, and that was something that was quite big. Now, obviously, not many people having meetings and conferences right now, so those spaces are stood empty. But that's another way of outsourcing it. And these are all, when we say flexible workspace, we don't just mean a serviced office or a co-working space. There's loads of elements, from a digital platform to a meeting and conferencing area to a tenant lounge in a building, to a managed suite that might be fitted out. So we see more of these. I'm sure you guys have seen it as well. It's landlords offering turnkey solutions to tenants as well. So that can speed up the kind of acquisition of space process. So there's all of these elements to flexible workspace, and I said earlier that the trick is working with our occupier to thread those pieces together to figure out which bits they need and how much of them they need, and then executing on it. And it's super interesting to be in the middle of all of that, because there's so many occupiers looking to do it. So versus, probably my time in Doha, as we said earlier, was quite different, where it was, you have a tenant, they want 10,000 square foot, you stick them in a floor of Tornado Tower, they sign a 5-year lease, and you give them a call in 4 years' time to see if they need more space or help with their rent review, and that's kind of it. Whereas this is where we are now, and I think it's not just me that's here now, the whole industry is here now, is really paying much more attention, much more strategy involved, and then still doing that transaction. But it might not necessarily be 10,000 square foot on a 5-year lease anymore. It might be 5,000 square foot here, a subscription to a tech platform here, an agreement with the landlord to outsource that part here. And it's much more nuanced. And I think from a real estate perspective, if you're in the real estate industry and you're not thinking like that, then you might not be around in another 5 years.
You're behind the times. It's absolutely spot on with what you just said. I asked 2, maybe 3 realtors last week, if someone comes to you, and fundamentally I'm going to ask you the same question to see what your response would be, because this just shows where real estate agents, shall we say, need to move. It's no longer about someone. So the question was, if someone approaches you and says, as a end user tenant, I require 1,000 square meters of office space, my question to them was, what do you say to that potential lead? And they said, I'm not quite sure what you're getting at. I said, well, did you ever turn around and say, how do you know? Or where did that 1,000 square meters come from? How did that 1,000 square meters calculate? If you do a simple mathematical exercise in this part of the world, in which you actually spend a bit of, I don't know, let's say education-based marketing, speculative space planning design, a bit of basic space analysis before you really get into the fundamentals of a workplace consultancy, you might find that they only need 800 square meters. Now, 200 square meters in Qatar, plus the fit out cost, plus service charges, over a 5-year lease, which is generally going to be on average. We're not talking small money. And right now, you're right. A lot of multinational corporates made the assumption, we'll round it up, we need 500 square meters or 1,000 square meters or 2,000 square meters. And they went with the flow, and they were more interested in acquiring the location. Tornado Tower, Doha Tower, Al Asmak Tower, areas like this, Al Fadan, obviously a very important one as well. And they were more interested in acquiring the location, and they took the size that was available to them. I mean, these are very, very important and busy towers. There isn't a lot of choice within the towers that we've just mentioned in Qatar. Now, surely it's the other way around. We have to look at the actual space that's being utilized and is required. We have to ensure that we have to ensure that the money that's being spent is being spent on actual space rather than a desired space.
Yeah, I agree. But I think there's a caveat to that. I think these depends on the company. You know, you could have a company that's making so much money and they need an office. You know, if it's a little bit too big, it's a little bit too big, and it doesn't really matter because it's, you know, in terms of what they pay their staff, in terms of everything else they do, you know, it's around, you know, that extra space is probably a rounding error on their balance sheet. So, but I agree with you that those things will become, you shouldn't be taking more space than you need. And a lot of the times people take more space than they need because they're scared they can't get it in future. But I think what we'll see, I don't think I've had a conversation with any landlord in the last 3 years, certainly in the last 2, where a landlord not thought they needed flexible workspace in some capacity in their building. Now rewind that back to my first 1 or 2 years in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has obviously gone through a lot of challenges in recent years, not just with COVID, but we have quite a lengthy period of protests against government. And so, you know, Hong Kong's gone through a bit of a turbulent time, but prior to that, vacancy rates in Hong Kong were at all-time lows. You know, if you wanted an office space in Central, it might shock you, but you had vacancy rates in some cases of less than 1%. And in some buildings less than 1%. That's climbed up a lot now and heading towards double digits, but it was less than 1%. So it was hard to deliver that flexibility. But now most landlords are delivering it in some capacity, and that might not be 1 or 2 floors of serviced office / co-working. It might be with a, you know, meeting facility. It might be with a third space lounge area. It might be with all those bits. But everyone that I've spoken to recently has acknowledged that they need it. It's just what they need to deliver. And I think we've talked a lot this morning / this afternoon on these big buildings and these big corporates, but not every business out there is an ExxonMobil or a Shell or a Citibank or a Standard Chartered Bank, you know, or HSBC, you know, or a Spotify or a LinkedIn. You know, not every company is that. You know, the majority of companies are much smaller. So, and not every building is as beautiful as Burj Dua, which is behind you, and not every building is as beautiful as some of the landlords that we talked about earlier, Hong Kong Land, Swire Properties, Capital Land, are amazing buildings in Asia. Not every building's like that, right? So you have buildings which might be grade B buildings, for example, in reasonably well located areas, smaller floor plates, but accommodate, you know, a big chunk of the market that also need space. But even those landlords are thinking, you know, they might not be putting 5-star hospitality services in there and Michelin stars restaurant, but they're still thinking about how they deliver something. Even those landlords are thinking about how they deliver something for the tenants. And I think that part of the market, I think, has got a lot of room to grow and a lot of potential creativity in it. And I'm speaking to a lot of those, some of those landlords in Asia that are thinking about how they do that in their building. And even those guys are thinking about, yeah, how do I do that? And I think for the smaller companies, it's even more important, because if you're a tenant that only has 5, 10, 20, 30 employees, you know, you can't afford that Silicon Valley office with the, you know, with the third space and beanbags and cafeteria and all that, because you don't have the scale to do it yourself. So in those cases, there's probably even more of a case in those buildings to offer shared services.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's important that the SMEs are not left behind. It's important that the SMEs, small organizations, entrepreneurial organizations, freelancers, adapt as well, and someone needs to support them. The corporates have a lot of resources in-house, and obviously organizations such as yourself. But what we're finding locally, where there is a presence from organizations such as Colliers, but not on the ground, we are getting a lot of those interactions. We are getting a lot of those conversations about what should they do. They've got 60, 70 employees, the lease is coming to an end, they're unsure of what they want to do, it's not their sector, and we're trying our best to give that perspective on what is coming in the next 12 to 24 months. Obviously, there's things such as the World Cup coming at the end of 2022, which no doubt I'm sure you'll be making a visit back to Doha.
I've got your spare room, haven't I?
Yeah, I think I've still got your bed in the villa from 10 years ago, I think. But yeah, SMEs, it's important that we stay on top of the SMEs and we help them as much as we can. The corporates will generally tend to take care of themselves, and obviously there's big money to be saved from the corporates. But when you're an SME turning over maybe $5 million a year, a 1 to 2% advantage on the real estate is still going to be important.
Yeah, I think from the landlord perspective, I think there's a lot of, you can really move the needle in terms of your building valuation and your income returns, your rental returns, if you're delivering those services, because you can make a far bigger percentage swing moving a building from, Hong Kong, for example, from $25 a foot to $30 a foot than you can moving a building from $100 a foot to 105. Those percentage swings are much bigger. So I think there's a huge opportunity in the grade B market. Yeah. I guess to caveat that, I would say what we've seen with rental compression in certain markets and higher vacancies is that potentially those grade B buildings, so I'm kind of contradicting myself here, some of those grade B buildings could get left behind, because now those tenants that were in the grade B buildings can now afford a grade A building because the rents have dropped off a bit. But that'll stabilize over time. So I think that there's a market for a well-positioned, for a well-located, repositioned grade B building to change their income profile or the rental profile and potentially their tenant profile. But there's also a risk for those grade B buildings, because certainly if they don't do that, they probably get left behind. So because people can now afford those grade A buildings. So I think that it's an interesting time, but there's opportunity out there. And I think landlords that get it right and deliver good product at the right price point will keep their occupancies high and retain their income, and in some cases, maybe even more. And I think occupiers are in a really interesting spot, because your point earlier, they've got far more choice now. And I think it's a really good place for the end user to be, because ultimately that end user should also get more choice and much more variety, I think, in what they're doing. And I think it's a really interesting place for the operators as well, because there's gaps in the market that weren't previously there that need someone to fill them. In terms of hospitality services, in terms of a broader range of offerings, and something we touched on earlier, probably a dispersed workforce. So, suburban markets, one of our forecasts at Colliers is that office space in suburban markets will likely improve, and potentially rental rates will increase in those buildings, because you'll have more demand for those versus the HQ building.
Yes, indeed. Jonny, we've run out of time.
That's it.
I can't thank you enough and we definitely need to do this again later in the year and see how things have progressed in Hong Kong. I'm really glad to have had you on the show, and glad you're enjoying life in the Far East. Don't forget about us in the Middle East, and I'm sure you'll be back soon. Jonathan Wright, you've been a fantastic guest. Stay on the line, but we'll end the show there. This has been Space Design and Build, episode 2 with Jonathan Wright from Colliers. Johnny, stay there and we'll have a quick chat afterwards.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Joffy.